Hello everybody and welcome to another video. A history video for once, not just one of my Rome 2 faction guides, where we're going to be rating the greatest empires. Now, obviously, this ranking of empires is going to be a matter of military history, so it'll be heavily biased towards that particular side of historical analysis. So if you're not particularly interested in military history and merely want to talk about the cultural impact of certain civilizations, and this ranking might not satisfy you. However, that's the way I'm going to do things. And of course, this ranking is going to be incredibly biased, and frankly, comparing these various civilizations is impossible to do without being simply biased and a little bit silly, because we have empires throughout the ages here, folks. We have everything from the Nazis to the Venetians to the Imperial Russian Empire to Soviet Union, the ancient Macedonians, the Romans. We're comparing empires and civilizations that existed 3,000 years apart, or almost 3,000 years apart. So ultimately, this is going to be a little bit silly, but also incredibly fun to do. Now, for every tier list, in order to actually be able to perform like a valid comparison, you need to have some sort of criteria. So I'm going to rank each empire according to three basic qualities. The first of which is, did we achieve impressive battlefield victories? Was their military something unique, something innovative, something well led by legendary commanders that just changed the game and left an impressive legacy? Or was their military just okay? You know, some empires are ultimately forged in areas or eras where perhaps things were not as militarily competitive as others. So ultimately, just because you had an empire doesn't mean that your military was anything particularly special. So we will be assessing in terms of battlefield victories. The second trait that we're going to consider is longevity, because ultimately an empire can be won through blood. However, it cannot be administered through blood. So it's a matter of whether the empire lasted very long or if it disintegrated within a generation. That also will take points off of an empire if it didn't last particularly long. Although we will consider the context in which it exists. During some periods of human history, it was a lot easier to have a stable government, while in others it was nearly impossible. So we will, of course, consider that. The third trait is cultural impact. Did the empire leave behind impressive works of art? Did it leave behind impressive ideas? Did it change the way that we think en masse? And does the legacy of this empire still resonate for us now? Or was it rather unimpressive culturally? Of course, cultural impact is a highly subjective thing, and my information, or let's say the information I value as a person born in Canada, will probably bias myself towards thinking an empire like, say, that of ancient Macedon or the Romans was more culturally impactful than, say, I believe that this is the Mughals. At least I'm going to consider this Islamic flag that of the Mughals, although I'm not so sure whether that is actually the flag of the Mughals. I mean, I just kind of feel Pakistani when I see this. I'm thinking Mughals. But this could just be like the original, like the first caliphate that spread Islam. I'm not so sure. But I'm just gonna say Mughals, okay? But like obviously I don't know very much about them. So essentially cultural impact is gonna be a way for me to just bias the empires that I think were really cool. Put them probably at the top, maybe denigrate others, but I'll try to be as unbiased and analytical in my view. Like, I'll try to explain my thinking at the very least. But if you disagree with me, just leave a comment. I love disagreements. I thrive on disagreements. Leave a comment and tell me how dumb I am. I would absolutely love that. Without further ado, let's just get right into this. First things first, I'm going to fully disclose I have no idea what this flag is. I didn't make this tier list, but I just don't know what country this is supposed to represent. It feels like when I see this flag, it kind of gives me the vibe of like something from the 15th century to 16th century. You know, some sort of like Renaissance or like early modern period in Europe flag. However, I just don't know what it is. And I was trying to Google it. I searched up like flag with blue and white, and I just couldn't figure out what it is like definitively. But you know what? Doesn't really matter. I'm just going to put it in don't know enough to rank, and let's see if anything else goes in there. Now I'm just gonna go immediately pick from the ones that I think I can easily rank here, and also actually just to kind of explain the categories. S tier is gonna mean like amazing, amazing, amazing. A tier is still gonna mean like really cool, really good, but simultaneously maybe deficient in one category, like maybe an empire didn't last particularly long, or perhaps if it didn't. Well, actually, I don't think it would even make A tier if it didn't win impressive battlefield victories, but perhaps the cultural legacy wasn't particularly rich. B tier will just mean average. C tier will be in below average for whatever reason. Perhaps it was deficient in two categories. D will mean sucky. Sucky. I really didn't like it, or I really don't rate them particularly highly. But in any case, first in S tier, Romans. Romans. I think about Rome all the time, as anybody who has watched my channel for other things probably knows. But seriously, how can you underrate the Romans? They effectively created a new style of warfare by kind of merging different tools and things that they picked up from other civilizations and creating a highly flexible yet professional system of fighting battles. Also, longevity is insanely impressive. I mean, if you consider the birth of Western Rome in 753, when Rome kind of achieved city-state status, all the way to the collapse of the Byzantine Empire, I mean, we're talking about a solid 2,000-year period. None of these other empires are going to come close to hitting that level of longevity. And in terms of cultural legacy, I mean, the Romans left so much art, so much philosophy, so many legal precedents and concepts that we still use today, so much technology. There's a battlefield victory. I mean, they won decisive battles against so many civilizations. I mean, they wiped out entire generations of civilizations of like opponents, right? They subdued the Macedonians, the Carthaginians, the Epirotes, the Illyrians, many German tribes, the Gauls, the Britons, the Hispanians. I mean, they were absolutely everywhere, and they won so many. Even like in the late Roman period, they won so many decisive battles against empires and civilizations that were substantially more numerous and healthier than them. I mean, if you just read about their wars against the Islamic world, sure, they didn't win much territory from them, but the fact that they were able to even stay alive for as long as they did, with the population and economic and social issues the Byzantines have, was impressive in of itself. So I'm going to rate Romans as S. I don't think anyone will dispute that. Now, going on to the next S tier, we're going to rate the Mongols as S tier as well. And this is just sheerly because of their battlefield victories. I mean, the Mongols, particularly during the generation of Genghis Khan, as well as moving on to the next couple of Khans, were an absolutely ruthless and impossible to beat force on the battlefield. I mean, they made the Chinese, as well as the Khorasan Caliphate, the Slavic principalities of the Kievan Rus, seemingly look like morons. And you know what's actually the most impressive thing about the battlefield victories the Mongols achieved in my eyes is that when they fought against the Qin, when Genghis Khan was in charge, during the decisive battles when Genghis managed to prevail over them, the Qin actually had more horse archers on the field than the Mongols, let alone all the infantry and other types of cavalry. I mean, they outnumbered the Mongols hilariously, right? But the Qin were a nomadic people, or at least a people with an origin as a nomadic people too. So they had way more horse archers than the Mongols, yet the Mongols were just so much more disciplined, better led, and skillful, but they managed to make them look like children. So it's just the battlefield victories alone of the Mongols put them in S tier, in my opinion. And if you've read at all about the conquest of Genghis Khan, how rapid they were, how simply inhuman his men seemed to be, I mean, both in their cruelty, but also their prowess as warriors, they really deserve to be an S. In terms of cultural impact, I mean, Kublai Khan did essentially unify China. I mean, there was the whole of that. You have the Mongols, for good or for ill, to thank for modern Russia in a sense. I mean, they definitely left a pretty rich and vivid cultural impact. Of course, not exactly the most cheery, but still, they definitely did. And also, when it comes to longevity, sure, the original Mongol Empire as a whole, that existed under Genghis, didn't really outlast him for very long, at least. However, the different kind of split off states of the Mongols, and if you count the Mughals as one, which I think you should, those lasted for a very long time into the early modern period. So I would say the longevity of the Mongol Empire, if you don't just consider like the whole of the Mongol Empire, but the states that split off from that, like they lasted quite a long time. Now let's get something that's on the other side. Nazi Germany, D tier. Fuck these guys, man. I hope that's not a I hope that's not a extraordinarily controversial thing to say. I hope not. Not in the modern day, but come on, man. Cultural legacy alone ruins them. Like, virtually all of these empires committed horrid atrocities, but it's solely these guys that are known entirely for their atrocities, more or less. And sure, yes, they did win some impressive battlefield victories against the French, against the Poles, with, of course, Soviets taking the Poles from the other side, against the Russians or against the Soviets at the beginning of Operation Barbarossa, of course, all the way through the beginning of their campaign. They were achieving monumental victories. I mean, the encirclement of Kiev was basically the largest encirclement in military history, and I don't believe that anything has beaten that thus far. However, the cultural impact, I mean, the Nazis are more or less a cautionary tale about the evils of fascism. I mean, every idea that the Nazis left behind, besides maybe how to compose an efficient bureaucracy and like it's say, the quality of blitzkrieg warfare has been awful. It's been absolutely terrible. It still contaminates modern society. So I'll put them in D. Also, I just hate the Nazis. So I'll do that. That's my bias. If I was to judge them solely on battlefield victories, I guess I'd probably have to put them in like C, because they did, for a time, greatly outperform anything that justifies, like, the fact that, like, the Germans didn't have the largest population in the world, or the most industrialized country in the world, or any of that, right? So, like, I can't really say that, but also longevity, to be fair. Like, well, I'm not going to count just Nazi Germany in the 30s, because that wasn't an empire. This is an empire tier list. So if we were to consider just the empire part, so let's just say not even Anschluss with Austria, let's just say when the Nazis invaded Czechoslovakia, that's the first time I can kind of call it an empire. Or perhaps, no, Czechoslovakia, I think it's fair, because only the Sudetenland was truly German. So if we only consider there from like 1938 or whatever, it wasn't a very long empire. At most, you can say it lasted 7 years. So yeah, longevity as well as cultural impact puts them in D tier. Now let's go for another one that I want to rate right at the top. Let's go for Macedon. Now the Macedonians, they created a style of warfare that would more or less change what the meta was for combat in the ancient world, at least until the Romans came in and reset everything. So because of that, you can absolutely say that the Macedonians deserve to be pretty high. You can also say the battlefield victories, that is particularly Alexander and Philip the Great one, were absolutely phenomenal. I mean, just crazy stuff. Philip the Great schooled both Athenians and Thebans simultaneously. Alexander the Great took down the Persian Empire, the Qing Dynasty, the largest empire to ever exist at that time, in 3 battles where he was pretty much outnumbered in each one. And the next like 200 years would be more or less dominated by Hellenistic superpowers like the Seleucids and the Ptolemaic dynasty. And they would continue to win battlefield victories against invaders and opposition, although they did get absolutely schooled by the Romans once the Romans became a competent power. And that's the thing, longevity was not really that great, but also cultural impact was phenomenal. I mean, this entire Hellenistic age produced so much math, so much science, so much philosophy. I mean, basically, like, the height of classical philosophy, besides, the OGs, like Aristotle and Socrates, was more or less during the Hellenistic era. And the Romans would more or less just emulate Hellenistic philosophy and use it to enhance their own base of knowledge. So cultural impact and battlefield victories gives it an A, I think, but longevity doesn't allow it to be an S. It had to last longer. Now, let's go for another one. Let's go for maybe something a little bit spicy. The Qing Dynasty. The dragon right here. Now, the Qing Dynasty did last surprisingly long, okay? It started like... I'm not an expert on kind of pre-modern Chinese history. All the courses I took in university for Chinese history were about modern history, like the history of modern Hong Kong or the history of modern China. History of Chinese immigration. Those are actually the three courses I took on Chinese history. So I don't know a ton about China in the 16th century beyond the kind of the overlap with the Mongols, because I read a decent amount about the Mongols. So when it comes to the Qing, I was actually rather surprised to realize that they basically were like from the 30s or something all the way to the early modern period once the Republican Revolution happened. So Sun Yat-sen. So longevity actually is not bad. Like 300, 400 years, that's fine, man. That's a fine amount of longevity. And they did reunify China after the Ming caused the collapse of the Yuan dynasty. They did expand. They expanded Chinese holdings to be over all of the non-Han minorities for the first time. I mean, they expanded all the way into like kind of Turkmen China. They expanded into Tibet, parts of it anyway. They went further than any Han Chinese ruled dynasty would, and they were Manchurian in origin, so they did practice a somewhat Mongol-esque style of warfare, at least they originally did. So they were able to achieve some pretty stunning battlefield victories against all the Asian powers that surrounded them in their expansionist phase, and they did subjugate and rule over a Han majority for a long time. So they were military competent, but it's the last period of decline, and it was a very long and extremely painful period of decline at the end of her empire that kind of paints it as bad. You know what I mean? Like getting humiliated by the British during the Opium Wars. That was really embarrassing. Getting humiliated by the Russians during the Great Game period of history. Really humiliating. I mean, there was like a rump state that broke away from the Qing Dynasty in like Islamic China, but lasted like 10 years. And the way that they retook it was just hilarious. Like, we levied a bunch of peasants that would, like, march while simultaneously, like, farming the land that they were marching over. And it took them, like, 3 years to eventually arrive and reconquer the area that they lost. Like, these guys were nothing resembling a modern state. Of course, their war against Japan also was just... ugh. I mean, there's a reason why it's called the Century of Humiliation, and... the complacency of the Qing Dynasty was largely to blame for that. So I do give him props for longevity. I do give him props for kind of setting up China to later be a unified state capable of modernizing. However, I feel like I have to put them in C tier. Just because this is a military history ranking, and the military of the Qing Dynasty for the last 100 years of its existence was just negligible and lost against pretty much everybody other than internally rebellious warlords, and sometimes not, because the army of this empire was more or less a decentralized thing run by warlords, like by the end of it. And the reason why it fell is because they basically adopted a more or less feudal system of conducting warfare. It's just, they were in a mess by the end. Okay, let's keep on moving, maybe at a brisker pace. Let's go to Imperial Japan. Well, you know what? If I have to rate the Nazis as D for cultural impact, I have to rate the Imperial Japanese as D. Because while in the West they don't get the same reputation for atrocities as the Nazis, they more or less did the same thing as the Nazis. Like, sure, it wasn't as systemic of a slaughter as like the Holocaust was, However, they did basically just go into several cities and just put people to the sword relentlessly. I mean, Nazis observers during the rape of Nanjing were horrified by what they saw, and those were Nazi party members. So I'm just saying, I'd be a massive hypocrite and a Eurocentrist to do anything else here. So I'm going to put them in D. But besides that, let's look at longevity. I mean, Imperial Japan, like, I'm not going to consider the conquest of like the local islands and the subjugation of the people there towards a more centralized Japanese culture as really like empire building, because I mean, we can't call everything an empire, right? But once they like conquered Korea, once they started conquered Manchuria, basically once they started taking possessions from the Chinese in the late 1800s, that's where you can say that Imperial Japan really started, and it only lasted till the end of World War II. So you could say we had like a 50-year run. That's really not that good. It's really not that good compared to a lot of these empires. It's really not amazing, and they only very loosely controlled most of the territories they conquered in World War II. Like they more overran those territories rather than fully subjugated them. So yeah, I'd say D because of that. Although they did win some impressive battlefield victories during World War II, particularly against the Republican Chinese. Okay, next. What shall we go for? Who shall it be? Who looks appetizing to talk about? Let's do it, boys. The Prussians. The Prussian Empire. Now, Prussian unification happened during the Franco-Prussian War, as well as I think during the Austrian-Prussian War. So those two wars are the ones that basically made this modern country. And the Prussians did demolish both the French and the Austro-Hungarians during those conflicts. So the Prussians were militarily very competent, okay? They created basically one of the first modern conscript systems in Europe, because traditionally during, say, the Napoleonic era and then the period that preceded it, most European armies that used draft soldiers, so basically all of them with the exception of the British, they would take people for like 10 years, 20 years, so very long periods of service. But the Prussians, they realized that when it comes to modern warfare, there's really no advantage of taking people for that long and subsequently having a much smaller and harder army to maintain. Because it doesn't take as long to train people for modern warfare as it did for Napoleonic warfare, where like morale was far more important. In modern warfare, you just slaughter them or they slaughter you pretty much. It's over. And, if you line up as they were in that period and just shoot at each other with rifles that shoot really fast, which is what they were doing for a brief period, you can teach people to do that in like 2 years. So what you could essentially do instead is draft people for much shorter periods of time, but have people in the reserve till they're like 30 or 40, which is what the Prussians had. And it's actually one of the reasons why they won the Franco-Prussian War, because they just had a significantly more efficient military because of this. Of course, they won against Austria because they just had far superior weaponry. But in the Franco-Prussian War, it really was this organization of our military, and more or less everyone emulated it after. Like the Prussians basically did create the model in which European states would try to model their military, so it was quite cool. Of course, the Prussian Empire didn't last particularly long, nor was it particularly vast. I mean, they did manage to unify all those German principalities that were part of the Holy Roman Empire and all of that, but it just never really got too big, and they lost all of their colonial settlements in World War I, so they really only had overseas colonies for like 30, 40 years. They had like less colonies than even Belgium and stuff like that, so they never really had an empire, but simultaneously they beat the French in the Franco-Prussian War. They beat the Austrians pretty handily during the war they fought against them. They beat the Danish, and they conquered part of Denmark. And then in World War I mean, to be honest with you, they were by far the best performing military during World War I, hands down. You really can't give it to anyone else. So I'll put them in B tier. I think their military feats are really impressive. I think in terms of cultural impact, they did um, create a lot of things that other modern European states did. Uh, what is it? They did mimic how, and also like early German cinema and stuff like that was actually pretty influential. But simultaneously, longevity is definitely a thing that takes away. And you know they did lose World War One, even though they did put up a really good fight. They did lose World War One, so yeah, that's why I'm gonna put them there. And to be honest with you, it was rather erroneous to even engage in that war, considering the alliance system that they had. They really should have tried to be more diplomatically astute. Speaking of World War One, though, Austro-Hungary, the failures of World War One, the absolute stupidest, dumbest, worst run army during World War One. I mean, if you just look up pictures of like who their commander was at the beginning of the war, Conrad von Hotzendorf, and you just look into his eyes, you see a complete lack of intellect in those eyes. He's just a dumb-looking person, man. And the Austro-Hungarian Empire, they performed as if they were led by morons. Yet it was a rather large empire. And you don't get such a large empire without, winning many a battles. Like, they were a force to be reckoned with. I mean, it wasn't the Austro-Hungarian Empire at the time, but they were a force to be reckoned with during like the 1600s and stuff like that. They definitely were. But they were the principal, powerful German state for quite a while. However, their decline as they became more and more and more administratively incompetent and militarily incompetent over the 1800s was profound. And in terms of cultural impacts, well, actually musically, really cool stuff. I mean, Austrian music from like the 1800s, when they're no longer a military superpower but still an empire, was amazing. I mean, come on, dude. Who doesn't like Johann Strauss? Da 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 da. But can I really like put them in B tier because of da 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 da? No, but I could put them in C. If we put the Qing in C because of a long era of decline and humiliation, we'll do the same thing for Austro-Hungary. But they definitely don't deserve to be in the same tier as the Prussians, who were very impressive, albeit for a short period of time. Now, let's find our next candidate, the British. Rule Britannia. Rule Britannia. The sun never sets over the British Empire. In terms of battlefield victories, absolute legends. I mean, come on. They were on the winning side of every single world war. They defeated Indian armies of humongous size. And keep in mind, like, some people that maybe never studied the British wars in India are under the impression that they were fighting against hordes of undisciplined troops with primitive weapons while they were, using prime British troops. It wasn't like that. Like, the majority of armies that they faced were led by foreign commanders and had lots of foreign mercenaries in their armies training them. Like, every single Indian, we could say Indian kingdom of Werf in that period already had modern-ish weapons and had plenty of advisors to train them to I'm obviously not the same level as the British troops, but to give them a chance at the very least. Yet the British, they just had amazing commanders. They just had absolutely amazing commanders, as well as such competent administration that they were able to conquer the world and maintain a hold on that. I mean, they only ceded Hong Kong in like the late 80s. And they still maintain we can say, preferable diplomatic alliance with all the Commonwealth countries. I mean, they still benefit from the empire that they had, and it was a long-lasting empire. It's a very long-lasting empire. I mean, obviously it expanded over time, but a lot of it was already in place come the early 1700s. So, I mean, come on. It was the largest empire ever in human history. Pretty much. Although it depends on how you count water bodies. I don't know, in terms of land base, it might be the Mongols, but yeah, I would just have to put British on top of Mongols, to be honest with you. I mean, the Mongols did win more impressive battlefield victories, but you have to consider the British longevity as well as the cultural impact, which is like unfathomable when it comes to the British. I mean, come on. The basis of so many modern countries is the British system. You can just see the impact of the British everywhere where you turn. While the Mongol impact is still there, but it's toned down. It's not as surface level as that of the British, although it may just be because the Mongol Empire was far longer ago, but still. Plus, the British, they did beat the descendants of the Mongol Empire when it comes to the Mughals. So, they 1v1. The British won. It's a horrible way to judge it. But let's just go off that, all right, guys? So, yeah, British S tier. I think that's unsurprising. I don't think anybody would dispute that unless they just hate the British, but what can you do? My quarrel is not with the British. Let's go for another empire here. You know what? If we're going to talk about British, and I already said that this one, we're going to call them the Mughals. Let's go for Mughals. And, the Mughals did leave a rich legacy. I mean, we have biryani because of the Mughals, guys. Have you ever had a really good chicken or a goat biryani? That's like literally a top 5 food for me. That's a top 5 food. If I forget my lunch, I'm going to a local Indian restaurant and I'm getting chicken biryani. You know how much food is considered Mughal food? How many how many amazing things came from it? Absolutely obscene stuff. But also, you do have the Mughals to thank for the spread of Islam throughout Pakistan. So the Mughals did leave a profound cultural impact that's still left today. And I assume, although I don't know much about modern day Pakistan, admittedly, but I assume that they also did leave a legacy of governance and stuff like that. Although I'm sure the British play a very significant role there as well. But simultaneously, did they have the most impressive historic battlefield victories? I mean, during Timur's time, yes. During Timur's time, yes. I actually don't know, to be fair. They must have fought against other Indian powers for centuries. This is a complete black hole when it comes to personal knowledge. So, you know what? Considering that they lasted until the British wiped them out. Considering that they were formed around the 1600s. I think that it's fair to put them around the same area as the Qing. I think I'll put them over the Qing because the Qing humiliations were a lot more profound. And to be fair, like, the thing is that when it comes to like the Mughals, they were not like some mammoth of a state, you know what I mean? Like compared to the Qing Dynasty China, which was like a paper tiger at the time. Mughals versus British, I mean, who you really expect to win? Maybe Mughals at their height would have stood a chance, but yeah, I think that this is fair. I think that this is very fair. Okay, let's go for the next one. Now, this is the Russian imperial flag. So let's go for the Russia. The Russian Empire. Now, some people might hate this guy. Some people might hate this. I'm putting him in A tier. Now, I know that the Russians have a reputation of somehow screwing up military ventures while simultaneously outnumbering their opponent heavily. I know that reputation is well earned. I know that the Russian Empire lost the Crimean War. I know that the Russian Empire performed pretty abhorrently during World War One. Like, they had horrendous casualties and little to show for it beyond the Brusilov offensive, which was more or less a counter-offensive against, German and Austro-Hungarian troops that had taken vast swaths of her territory. And what they basically did was they powered through exhausted lines of Austro-Hungarians, mostly Austro-Hungarians, only to be pushed back by the Germans immediately after. The Brusilov offensive, it's considered like some great success because, it was a moment of hope in a sea of Russian failures in that war, but it didn't really give the Russians a whole lot. And at that point, the Russian military was already so rebellious that they weren't really willing to continue pushing forward, even though Brusilov wanted him to. So what I'm saying is that the Russian Empire had some catastrophic failures at the end, but we do have to remember that they did have the largest continuous land empire for like a good 200 years of history. And during the 1800s, they were basically the principal threat to the British Empire, the principal rival. The chance of the two of them erupting into a full-blown conflict over Central Asia was actually quite paramount. Now, last year, now it's 1st of January, so I could say last year I read The Great Game, and that book has convinced me that the Russian Empire was more or less a terror to all of Europe until kind of like that later 1800 period, when it was quite apparent that their political system and the way that their society was organized was a thing that would hold them back indefinitely and ensure that Russia would never become a competent superpower in the modern age. However, during the 1700s as well as up until the mid-1800s, Russia was an absolute Goliath, a terror to all of Europe, and they were expanding in Asia at a pace that defied logic almost. When you look at the size of Russia on a map, it doesn't do it justice. And the reason why it's still the largest country in the world is because of all of the conquests and efforts made during the Russian Empire. So I do have to put them in A tier because the impacts are still felt today, and they've been felt for so long. Culturally, the Russian Empire, despite being known for the immense suffering of its people, did have some of the greatest cultural achievements architecturally, musically, in terms of literature too. It's always been a weird societal contradiction, but still, in terms of cultural impact, it's really high. In terms of battlefield victories, the Battle of Poltava, the victory against Napoleon, the absolutely insane victories over the Khan of Kokland and the other peoples of Central Asia whom outnumbered them like 20-1, yet they'd still win battles. There's a reason why it got so big, guys. You can't just stupidly lose battles every single time you go out to war and somehow end up with an empire that big. No empire is made that way. It is at the end of the day, when Russia got that reputation for sucking, it was during the age of Russian decline. Yet, at the end of the day, unlike the Qing Dynasty, the Russians were far better at maneuvering and recovering, so they never suffered the same levels of humiliations besides against the Imperial Japanese. So we're putting them in D for unspeakable crimes against humanity, so sorry, Imperial Japan, but truthfully, I probably should put Imperial Japan and Nazi Germany like somewhere higher if I was being completely honest here, but screw them. So let's keep on moving here, guys. Let's keep on moving. Who are we doing next? You know what? If we just did Russia, let's do Soviet Union. Soyuz Vereshimi. Let's do these guys. Now, Soviet Union didn't last super long, okay? We can consider the formation of the Soviet Union in 1922 when the Russian Civil War was pretty much over. I know that there was still like holdouts in Siberia and stuff until like 1926. Technically, the Japanese were still in Siberia in 1926. Search it up. Japan had a very interesting expedition into Siberia during the Russian Civil War. But let's say 1922 to 1993, I think, was the end of the Soviet Union. But still, Guys, this is not very long. Like, a lot of these empires and civilizations lasted hundreds of years. We really can't put Soviet Union in S tier because of longevity alone. That already is going to denigrate it. In terms of battlefield victories, they defeated the Imperial Russian White Army, but that's a win against itself. Do they really count that? They really count that? Now, what else happened during the Soviet Union? They lost a war against Poland when they tried to expand. I will consider the Soviet victory against the Imperial Russian Army because the Imperial Russian Army was also funded and supplied by foreign powers. And in theory, the Central Russian hordes that were being used against mostly like Ukrainian Cossacks and stuff when it came to, the war against Denikin or the Siberians that were under Kolchak's direction. I mean, they were different people. So we'll consider Russian Civil War a victory, but then obviously they lost the war against Poland in that same era. So that kind of exposed the weakness and disorganization of the early Red Army. Then they suffered a humiliating victory against the Finns during the Winter War. The war against the Nazis was a success, but you always have to put asterisks next to the Soviet victory because basically their entire logistical system was given to them by the Americans, right? So at the end of the day, and by logistics I mean like all the trucks, the whole Lend-Lease program, right? I mean, they were kept afloat by Allied aid, but if you can't rely on your allies in a war, then like just because you got help from your allies in a war shouldn't really be a huge hit against you. But some of the greatest victories and defeats during World War II were done by the Soviets. It meant that the Soviets really win any military victories after that. I mean, the Soviets, they helped out during the Korean War, like they helped the Chinese. But let's be real, like the fighting was not done by the Soviets. They just airlifted some supplies and sent some advisors to help Mao out when he marched his troops, or rather his son marched and died with his troops in Korea, in North Korea. They went into Afghanistan. That was a failure. But there wasn't a ton of like hot conflicts for the Soviets. Like the main Soviet victory was over the Nazis and the Japanese. The Soviets did shit on the Japanese though during World War II. They really did. Like they won in Khalkhin Gol in 38 before the Soviet army even got super good. And they also did win in 1945 when they invaded Manchuria against an already tired and ill-equipped Japanese army. When the Soviets were at their height, they absolutely blew them. Responsible for an entire era of European separatism with the Iron Curtain. Highly culturally impactful. You can more or less look towards the Soviets for most Marxist countries outside of China's sphere of influence during this era. No Cold War without the Soviets. Cultural impact definitely high. Great music, great movies. I can personally say that. I'm putting them in B tier with the Prussians. I feel like that's where they belong. Some innovation for sure. I would say that the Soviets had more cultural impact than the Prussians, but I would say that the Prussia's military history is a lot cleaner, and they did fight in a lot more wars than the Soviets. That is because of the era in which they existed, but you can't discount that. So I'll put Prussia over USSR, but I'm putting Soviets in B tier. Most Soviet wars were fought against their own people at the Gulag, though. Okay, next, guys. Next. I believe that this is the Holy Roman Empire. I don't know much about the wars of the Holy Roman Empire. I'm putting them in don't know enough to rank. Sorry, just my whole knowledge of Renaissance, early modern history is not particularly good. I can do the Spanish. I know enough about the Spanish, but I don't know enough about the Holy Roman Empire. So I don't know much about Central Europe in this era, other than Martin Luther's Protestant Reformation. So, I mean, what can I do, right? I believe that this is the Byzantine Empire. I'm going to say that this is the Byzantine Empire. And I'm putting Byzantine Empire in A tier. A tier, guys. Because let's just say this, right? Let's say Byzantine Empire is going to start from around like the late 300s AD when the West-East divide was extremely pronounced, and is going to go all the way till its collapse. That is a longevity of like 800, 900 years. That's better than almost everybody here by far. In terms of military history, search up Belisarius, man. Search up Belisarius. Simply look at the plethora of opponents he managed to best or at the very least survive against immense odds, from the Avars to the Persians to the Vandals to the Visigoths to the Ostrogoths. The Byzantines fought against so many opponents and managed to survive and were there during the Crusades. I mean, yes, by the time that they fell to the Turks, they were nothing but a hollow shell. I mean, basically Constantinople in that period was a bunch of villages inside of the walls of a city. It must have been an absolutely decrepit and odd place to be in the 1400s before the Turks revived it and actually made it a city again. But, of course, an Islamic city. But regardless, during its height, they were still a bastion of Western civilization during the Dark Ages, when all of Western Europe was more or less in a pathetic, derelict state. And they did maintain a effective system of governance, one based upon logic and administrative soundness, when they could say the rest of the Western world was going to crap. So I do have to say that the longevity side is there. The cultural impact is definitely there. I mean, once all the Byzantine and classical knowledge got back to the Western Europeans, that literally spawned an entire era of thought, one so pronounced that it's considered like a shift in the paradigm of how people thought, the Renaissance. I mean, we have to put these guys in A tier. Who is next, guys? I mean, I'm saving the ones I know less about, but I think I can rank most of these. I can say that for sure. Let's do the Ottomans. The sick men of Europe, although at one point during the reign of Suleiman Magnificent, the scourge of the Balkans, they conquered all the way from the deserts of Egypt to Hungary, modern day Hungary. I mean, they had a massive empire. They won many, many, many decisive battles during the early modern period. They were one of the early pioneers of disciplined warfare with guns. To be fair, they failed to adapt later on, but the thing is that even when they're considered like the sick men of Europe, like that type of stuff, they didn't suffer the same type of like humiliating defeats that the Qing Dynasty did. Like, they were on the winning side during the Crimean War. Yeah, they wouldn't have beat Russia in that period on their own, but who cares? They were on the winning side of the Crimean War. They were, let's say that during World War One, sure, but they were on the losing side, and they did do some really dumb shit during World War One. To be fair, like, it's not well known in the West, but let's just say that they lost some pretty hilarious battles against the Russians. Even they had a very, very incompetent commander named, I think, Mustafa Pasha or whatever. And to be fair, if I'm going to use the war crimes thing, I mean, they did kidnap a ton of people. They did castrate a lot of people. They did kill a lot of Armenians during World War One. Although, I mean, I don't know. I feel like comparing genocides is really, really tacky. If I put these guys in D, I feel like to be fair, all of these people were somewhat genocidal, so I don't know. My gut's telling me not as bad as the Nazis or the Imperial Japanese. That's the thing. World War One in general, they did not have the same level of atrocities that these guys did, but Just for the record, the Turks did some really fucked up stuff during World War One to the Armenians. But this is an empire tier list. Can't really be that empathetic. I'm putting him in A. I'm putting him in A behind the Russians because their empire was not as large, although you could claim that the Ottomans did take vastly more populated and subsequently more impressive territory. But I'm going to put them behind the Russians. I'm going to put them behind the Russians just because their empire was smaller. And also, the two of them did 1v1 plenty of times, and the Russians came on top more often. And I'm putting them on top of the Byzantines because they did directly end the Byzantine Empire, guys. They did directly end the Byzantine Empire. Can also say longevity. I mean, the thing is that I feel like the Turkish longevity, I mean, it was really long. It's really long. But also, like, I feel like the longevity is more impressive. Like, 500 years of, like, Ottoman rule is more impressive than keeping control of Byzantium when you have like ancient Roman technology, ancient Roman traditions. Like you have all of these technological advantages, and of course some incredibly populated urban centers that managed to survive collapse of the Western Roman Empire. Like it's a lot more impressive the amount of time that these guys survived in the era that they were at the height of than these guys. When it was like the Dark Ages. And it is vastly more impressive in most civilizations out there. But yeah, let's try to end this, guys. I'm going to go a little bit quicker for the last ones. Okay, so we have the Spanish over here. I am going to put the Spanish at the... I'm going to put them at the top of B tier. Because while the Spanish Empire, in theory, did survive a very long time, I'm going to be completely honest here. They were not in good shape come the 1800s at all. Like by the time that we get to the Napoleonic age, okay, just read about Napoleon's invasion of Spain. His army absolutely dumpstered the Spanish, and there's a reason why. Like once the Spanish just stole a crap load of silver from the New World, and once silver became subsequently a lot less useful, and their whole like loot-based economy couldn't really work, they became an absolute shell of their former selves. Like the golden age of Spain was a relatively short period, and afterwards it was just a steady decline of their empire. Just a steady decline of her empire. Like during the entire modern period of Europe, Spain has not really been a particularly modern country. I mean, there's a reason why they went fascist and stayed fascist. There's a reason why. So, like, I'll put them in B tier. I think I'm going to put them behind these guys. Because truthfully, like, the entire conquest of a new world, there is a whole caveat to how impressive it is that, first of all, they were supported by a lot of indigenous allies because no one really liked the Aztecs. And also the whole, like, you can bring a disease that'll kill 90% of the population. But really, like, imagine you're a commander in any area, and if you just wait, 90% of the population will die. That makes it easier to conquer anything. That's just a fact. Now, the cultural impact of these guys is they did create one of the most effective, or we could say one of the first rational ways of trying to use guns en masse during the pike and shot era, during the early 1500s, when guns were starting to be integrated. And the Spanish monarch was one of the first, we could say, leaders in European history to actually basically demand that his army was armed with a significant number of guns. Because, like, at least when I took military history in university, my professor would constantly sell, but there was basically no logical reason why European armies changed to guns from, like, crossbows. Crossbows were just a more effective tool compared to like early muskets, which were hilariously bad and ineffective. Yet the Spanish monarch wanted to change over, and he was kind of, we could say, the influencer here. And obviously it left a pretty profound, if not terrible, legacy upon the world. So let's just say that. I mean, the reason why all of Latin America, other than Brazil, speaks Spanish, I mean, that's in of itself a humongous cultural impact. So yeah, I mean, I'm just going to say B tier here. When it comes to the Swedes, I'm putting them in C tier. I mean, they really did punch a lot higher than their weight. Like, it kind of, like, literally, like, when we're considering like Austro-Hungarian incompetence or like Qing incompetence, like the Swedes never had that incompetent era. It just they never had the population to, you know, stay a super strong power during the early modern period. Like there's no way that they would have been able to maintain their holdings against the Russians. There's no way. And it wasn't just the Russians that were thirsting after the Swedes, but their army in the 1600s was incredibly efficient, incredibly effective, very well led routinely. It just, they never had the population to actually be an empire for long, but it's rather impressive that they were. It just, compared to like these other empires that had more land, that had more longevity, that won more impressive battles. Although the Swedes did win quite a few impressive battles, but I'm sure some of these guys did too if I just knew more about them. My instinct says Sweden belongs here, but, you know, for such a small nation, they did do a lot of impressive stuff. Holland, the Dutch Empire. Like, amongst all of the, like, modern empires, I really can't put them super duper high. They definitely don't have the same illustrious military history as, say, the Prussians, but I think I could put them at the bottom of B tier because they did have some pretty prominent colonies like Indonesia, stuff like that, the Dutch East Indies. They did have a pretty, like, the thing is that the Dutch had enough colonies to make themselves extremely rich, and they did manage to overthrow the Spanish, for savior, Spanish overlords. Despite Spain being a considerably more powerful and prosperous nation at the time. So I think the Dutch belong here, but let's be honest, compared to some of these other nations, they're not really so hot. And then the French. I'm going to consider this like an amalgamation of the French all the way from kind of the early modern period up till kind of the collapse of the French Empire during decolonization. To the collapse of like French Indochina, the African colonies. But that's the thing. Like, they had vast colonies in China, in Southeast Asia, in Africa, for a time in India, for a time in North America, for a time in the Caribbean. They had more colonial possessions than the Spanish, but then they also had Napoleon, one of the greatest military leaders in human history. I mean, I'm putting this guy, France, in A. I'm just considering them versus Russia because the Russians actually basically have still kept their empire. And that's the only reason why. That's the only reason why. I feel like the French had more cultural impact in terms of like law and stuff, but I feel like artistically, them and the Russians are pretty similarly, and architecturally, they both have a lot of cool stuff. But I just feel like geopolitically, the impacts of the Russian Empire are still more felt today, and France not as much. And I don't know, I kind of like this. The only thing that, like, to me, like, I'm still considering Soviet versus Prussia, but I'm kind of putting military victories of the Prussians above the cultural impact of the Soviets, which I think is higher, because, you know, spread of Marxism and socialism and stuff. I mean, it's pretty impressive. But then I feel like the Macedonian Empire is a little bit out of place here. I feel like, you know, it did end up collapsing in a couple generations. And, I feel like this is more fair. I feel like Byzantine for longevity alone should be up here, as well as it did do some pretty impressive battlefield victories. But anyway, guys, here is my tier list. Thank you for listening to its long-winded, disorganized rant. I hope you guys enjoyed. And let me know what you think. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Do you hate it? Do you think that I know nothing? Do you think I know everything? Please let me know in the comments, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye for now.